This is Mike Balaban. You're listening to Bammer and Me. Welcome to our podcast series. Today, my guest is Hudson Taylor, a longtime friend and fellow board member of a nonprofit called athleteally, which he founded 10 years ago. We met about 10 years ago. I'd read about you and your work. You were a curiosity to a lot of people, a straight, white, handsome collegiate wrestler who had taken up the mantle of Lgbtq rights. Then I approached you at a benefit where I believe you were being honored for your allyship to the LGBT community. I told you how the work you'd been doing served as a role model for LGBTQ inclusiveness in sports. It reminded me of David Kope, the former NFL football player who came out publicly in 1975 and who became my mentor when I was going through the same process. I offered to help you, joined the board of athleteally, and ended up serving as its founding chair for 5 years. As we celebrate its 10th anniversary, I'm about to roll off the board, this month in fact, and athleteally is honoring 5 of us longtime board members at a dinner tonight. I thought this seemed like a good opportunity to interview you, share with our audience what you and we have accomplished, and publicly celebrate those milestones, as well as talk a bit about your personal history. Let's get right into it. Well, first of all, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
When people first look at you, a handsome, white, cis male, they might see privilege. But your background contradicts that impression. Would you tell us about your upbringing, your family history, and how you became involved with wrestling as a sport at an early age?
So I grew up as a wrestler in a soccer town. I started wrestling when I was 5 years old. It has been and continues to be probably one of the most important things in my life. But I grew up in a soccer town. So where I think most athletes are given a lot of cultural capital because of their sport, I was actually like, it was not cool. It was not popular. It was, I would get made fun of because of that leotard thing you're wearing and you're grabbing each other. So there was lots of homophobic jokes and innuendo from an early age in wrestling. That was, I guess, sort of plot point 1. Plot point 2, I grew up in a really religious family. So my great-great-great-grandfather was a guy named James Hudson Taylor who brought Christianity to China. So I was raised in an evangelical Christian home. My mom went to Lancaster Bible College. My sister went to a Christian college. So faith was a really important aspect of my upbringing. I was not raised with the most inclusive faith-based interpretation of the LGBTQ community. So that was something I was always metaphorically wrestling with over the years. And then third, at an early age, I became really passionate about theater and about the arts and music and dancing. And, in 5th or 6th grade, I was in the Nutcracker and the ballet.
Did you get called names because of that?
I did. I mean, yeah, but there was sort of this trajectory, right, where I think for anybody, you have these social pressures that weigh on you. You have this way in which you see yourself and ways in which you want others to see you. And we're constantly managing our impression management, right? We're trying to make sure people see us the way we want to be seen. But what started to happen is in 5th grade, I moved to a new town, and that town loved wrestling. And that town, being a good wrestler was cool. So I very quickly went from being on the bottom of a social hierarchy to now being on the top. And I had kind of come out of this place where I wasn't wrestling for anybody other than me. I wasn't doing it because it was cool, because it was liked. I kind of found all these passions and interests that I pursued regardless of what anybody thought. So that was my sort of initial orientation in the sport of wrestling. I ended up going to the number 1 wrestling high school in the country. And so that was a place where wrestling was life. It was everything. And I was first one of the only wrestlers who ever did theater, music. But I got...
Was wrestling an escape from the kind of overwhelming religiousness of your family or not?
No. I mean, wrestling was... I think at first you do something because that's a thing to do. And then you do something because you realize you have potential and you could be great at something. And I would say at an early, sixth grade, I won nationals for the first time. And so sixth grade was sort of my inflection point where I was like, this is something I could be great at. And, all the other sports I dabbled in, but I was not very good. Not that couldn't catch, couldn't throw a ball worth a damn, but wrestling I could be great at. But sort of on top of that was always this religious history that I felt, because everywhere I went, it was, how's your walk with Christ? Like, I am the direct descendant of James Hudson Taylor, who converted more people to Christianity than anyone other than Paul the Apostle. So there's these shoes to fill, which always really weighed on me and made me feel like I had to live a very Christian life. I had to go to Christian camps and be a member of the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. And so I did. Up until college, I was pretty active in the sort of Christian athlete community.
So what freed you from that?
As I got better and better at wrestling, I got permission to be different, to not care.
From yourself?
From myself and from others, right? I think that, when somebody achieves the top of their industry, they're given license to bend or break the rules in ways that are against the norm. When I started at Blair, even though it was very counter to the norm of the culture.
Blair Academy.
Yeah. When I got to high school, Blair Academy, I was a 3-time prep national champ in high school. I was one of the top prospects coming out of high school as a wrestler. So that athletic success gave me permission to be the lead in the musical, and to be in the choir, and to join the dance team, or to lean into my artistic side of me in ways that people couldn't disparage or make fun of or kind of try to isolate or exclude me, because I was so good at this thing that they
and to also lean away from religion, which then begs the question, how did your family react to that?
Yeah. So the religious journey was, honestly, a lot of that happened in high school, because I had friends in theater they weren't out at the time, but I had lots of teammates who were making homophobic jokes about those kids who were my friends, right? And I'd say at the time I was not at a place socially where I was still, the pressures holding me back from speaking out and being a good ally were still acting upon me in a way that I wasn't like, no, don't talk about my friends that way, right? I still might have been quiet when I shouldn't have, or laughed at a joke that I shouldn't have. But
well, that's a good segue.
Yeah.
Because college was where you did begin to stand up as an ally. So
yeah.
Why don't you tell us about how you got into college and how that all evolved, particularly when you went into your first theater classes?
Yeah, so I had an opportunity to go to a lot of different schools, and I ended up choosing University of Maryland because it was a place where I thought that I could excel both as an athlete and in theater. There were a lot of places that I didn't really feel, I feel like I was being sold something that wasn't super genuine. But Maryland, I was like, no, I can do theater, I can pursue my interest in the arts and excel at an elite level. So I started in Maryland as a theater major and a music minor in vocal performance. And it was different for me because in high school, all of my theater friends were closeted. In college, those same theater kids, but now at Maryland, were starting to come out. And so my relationship to the LGBTQ community, while it hadn't changed in fact, it was changing in my perception of it, because now I had people who were out and who were in my life who I knew. And I always tell this story, this kid, Matt, who sat next to me every day my freshman year in one of my theater classes. One day, 5 minutes before class started, he stood up, took a deep breath, and said, "Class, I have an announcement. I'm gay." And the entire class erupted in high fives and hugs and applause. And it was a really beautiful celebration of this personal yet public step that Matt was taking to being truer to himself. And I was really struck by the support that he got, but then also the juxtaposition of that with the culture of my wrestling team. It's wow, if that had happened on my team in our locker room, I don't know if we would have had that same reaction. And then to be with my teammates and hear that tired kind of daily homophobic language kind of started to put things in
I
perspective.
think at that time, that's probably charitable to say, I don't know if it would have been that reaction, right?
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Yeah.
So that was, my first awareness raising. But then what happened was, I quickly found that I couldn't be a Division I athlete and have time to be in a lot of the shows because it takes way too much time to do both. So at Maryland, you can actually create your own major. So I actually changed my major to being interactive performance art. So I created my own curriculum, handpicked my classes, and I really was interested in theater as a political form of activism. How could we create an interactive experience that actually teaches somebody about a social justice issue? And so, in pursuit of that major, I started to take a lot of philosophy classes, women's studies classes, queer theory, sociology, American studies. And that was, I'd say, the real work of unpacking my privilege, of understanding systems of oppression and the ways in which the LGBTQ community in particular have so many things stacked against them in our law and in society in ways that I'd been aware of, but those classes and that education were really important in my kind of ally education to get to a place where I felt comfortable being a more vocal activist. I would say the other things that were happening in college for me was Barack Obama was trying to become president. I was in, University of Maryland, so out of season on the weekends, I would go and do canvassing for Obama. So I was, really starting to believe that I had the ability to affect change. If I saw something wrong in the world, that I could do something about it, that there was that hope and that optimism that really inspired me.
Were you already recognizing that your platform as a successful and visible athlete leader would help, or you just were thinking about it from Obama made you feel that you could be empowered?
Yeah, I didn't connect those dots for a long time because, wrestling is not the most popular sport. It's not like our home duels weren't sellout crowds. It was like, 50 parents coming together in a pretty quiet auditorium. So I didn't really see any kind of power that I had with my athlete status. But, Obama then wins. You have this amazing moment of celebration, but then you also have Prop 8 in California,
which made LGBT marriage, same-sex marriage, illegal.
Right.
Right.
And so here you had this victory, which I was like immensely felt very proud of and, did my part to bring about. But on the other hand, we have this rolling back of rights for an entire community, right? The ability to have the freedom to marry, and how ridiculous and tragic that was really struck me. And then shortly after the It Gets Better project came to national prominence, there was a real clear kind of national understanding of LGBTQ youth suicides. And that was something that I really wasn't aware of, how hard it was, what young LGBTQ kids were dealing with. And so I think that further crystallized for me that there was a lot that the LGBTQ community, they lacked rights. There was an environment which was leading kids to feel as though they had no other option than to end their life, which was and is a tragedy. And again, kind of all that put together got me to a place where I was like, okay, I need to try to tackle and address this a little bit more head on.
So tell us what happened in your locker room and where you were at that point when it happened that really spurred you in the path that is kind of defined your last decade plus.
Yeah, for sure. So, it's funny because I'm doing this podcast because of a sticker that changed my life. And it's funny how such a 2-second decision can be so monumental in a person's life. I actually think most amazing things happen in 2 seconds, right? 2 seconds where somebody stands up and speaks out, or 2 seconds where somebody is silent when they shouldn't be. That's where good or bad things happen in that little moment. But for me, it was a sticker. I was on campus and somebody approached me in the quad that said, "Hey, do you support marriage equality?" I was like, "Heck yeah, I do." And I signed the petition and the pledge, and I got an HRC, a Human Rights Campaign sticker thanks to signing that.
For those who aren't aware, the Human Rights Campaign is the largest LGBTQ nonprofit for LGBTQ rights, and their symbol or their logo is a yellow equal rights symbol on a dark blue background.
Yeah. So I got that sticker, and I was a late bloomer when it came to driving a car. I didn't have a car. I didn't really have anything that I could put this sticker on. And so in some ways it was a
Fluke.
Yeah, it was like, you know what? This would look really, I literally was just like, this would look really cool on my headgear. I'd seen so many athletes growing up with Philippians 4:13, right? Like Bible verses taped on their headgear and different things like that. And so I said, you know what? Like this really aligns with my values and what I believe in. And if other athletes can share their faith through sport, why can't I share my political beliefs through sport? And so I put that HRC sticker on my headgear, really not thinking much of it. Just this would look cool. This is reflective of my beliefs in the world. And it was the first domino of a lot of different things that happened. First, I definitely had a lot of really heated debates with my teammates over the wearing of that sticker. We had a lot of deep debates about marriage, and definitely had teammates on opposite ends of that fight.
Maybe I've simplified it in my mind, but I have the impression that you more or less, as captain of the team your senior year, decided that, I have a platform for influence, and I'm going to tell my teammates, I don't want any more of that homophobic or misogynistic language you hear in the locker room. It's just not acceptable. Is that correct or not?
I was already kind of laying down those lines in my daily interactions with the team, because at this point I was a two-time All-American, captain of my team. I was a SAC rep, which for those who don't know, that's basically student government for athletes. So I was a SAC vice president. So I was a student leader. So I kind of in all these ways was like, no, I have a responsibility to define what is and is not acceptable on my team. So I was definitely defining those lines when it came to homophobic, sexist, racist, ableist language. I was doing that pretty consistently. I think the sticker was more sort of an icing on that cake, or even more
and publicly visible,
and more publicly visible. And so that really was a big shift, because I think, for some of my teammates, they really believe that I should keep that off the mats or keep that out of public discussion. But
that's something that, you can go back to the Olympics and all the people that stand up there, right? Including 2014 Sochi, which Athlete Ally got involved in. So there's a long history of athletes debating whether we have a right and should stand up for things we believe that are outside of athletics.
I have a lot of thoughts about that, which we will get into in great detail. But to speed up my the origin story of Athlete Ally, one of my coaches at the time pulled me aside and said, Hudson, I see you wearing this sticker, having these heated debates with your teammates. Would you be willing to do an interview about why you wear this sticker?
I'm going to give him a shout out just because his name is Akil Patterson. He was a former tackle on the Maryland football team and I think a Greco-Roman wrestling contender at the Olympics, right?
Yep.
And you didn't know he was a closeted gay man.
Nope. So Akil, pulled me aside, connected me with OutSports. I did this interview about why I wore the sticker, and kind of got to really lay out all the things that I thought and believed and was continuing to learn about, my role, I think, in dismantling homophobia, transphobia in sport. And, one of the things that I think has always been really important to me in this work is that progress doesn't occur unless we engage in difficult dialogue. So I asked the folks at OutSports to share my email address, as I know they routinely do. But, I shared my email address with that article. I said, please, let's reach out, be in touch, let's talk, all right? And I just wasn't ready for the response. Again, I was still operating in this worldview where I was a wrestler and I'm not a revenue generating sport. And, I know I'm very good at my sport, but I just didn't really think that I had a national platform at all. And then, probably 2 days after that article posted, I opened up my email and I had over 2,000 emails from, LGBTQ athletes, from parents of LGBTQ athletes, from so many different people in the community.
Mostly closeted.
Mostly closeted. And it just knocked me back.
What did they say?
Just story after story of how people were dealing with homophobia in very real ways, not able to tell their teammates, tell their coach, tell their family. And here I was like, I've spent my whole life loving sports, having a home and a family in sport, and really taking it for granted. I've never worried that my team was going to ostracize me or turn their back on me. And story after story after story was just athletes who felt as though if they were to share who they were with their team or with their loved ones, that they wouldn't be there for them. And so there was this sort of separation, like in email after email, like that athletes felt as though they had to hide in order to pursue the sport that they love, that they really had to like separate who they were from being from an athlete and an individual.
And that's not even, or that's discounting all those people that said to you, I was afraid to go out for a sport. I didn't think there was a place for me in the locker room, right?
Absolutely. And, and parents who said, I've never really thought about these issues. And I just read that, I wrestled my whole life. And now I read this article about you and the sticker and the headgear. And now, I realize how important it is for me to be more vocal, for me to support my gay son, right? Like things like that. And
that's an idea.
Yeah.
That's an initial realization.
Yeah.
Of an opportunity.
Yeah.
Of a power that information has. That maybe you do have a platform. What happened next?
So one of those emails was from Fred Raffetto, who's another, founding board member who was a lawyer in New Jersey. And he said, hey, I read this article, and if you ever need anything, please let me know. So at first, Athlete Ally, wasn't actually thinking about it as an organization. I really was thinking, is there a way in which I could help uplift these stories that I was getting? Because I was getting thousands of emails from athletes who have experiences that people should know, right? It really impacted me in a deep way. And as a white, heterosexual, cis athlete, I've gone through my whole life never hearing these stories, never knowing the pain that is being caused by homophobic jokes, right? I mean, we know it, but to hear it, to read it, to see it really, really touched me. And at first, my hope was to capture it and figure out a way to share it with the world. But I guess at first was like, okay, well, let's make a website. And what should that be called? Okay, I'm an athlete, I'm an ally, I'm an athlete ally. So that became Athlete Ally. And then, well, okay, you have a website. Well, what is the website, right? What do you do on a website? I said, okay, well, I think for me, first thing that's really important is a pledge. For me, it's like, there's a way in which people are conducting themselves that should change. And if we could convince more athletes and coaches and people within sport to commit themselves to changing that culture, changing their behavior, that would be a good start. So we had the website and we just threw up a pledge. I pledged to do my part to make sport a more welcoming space. And then, started to talk to Fred, and sort of this idea emerged of like, you know what, this should be more, this can be more. So, Fred reached out and said, can you help us get our 501c3 status?
Which is a nonprofit incorporation.
Yeah. And at the time, Fred was not out at work. He was, not out to the partners at his law firm. And, we unbeknowingly put him in a really challenging situation because here I was asking him for pro bono legal services. He needed to go to the partners of the firm to get approval for that.
And why would he care about an organization like this?
Right. But it ended up being just a really beautiful story where he, got that pro bono support. He came out. He became a partner at the firm.
The firm supports us financially.
Yep.
Yeah.
They threw our first fundraiser in Asbury Park. And just a beautiful thing. And so that's how Athlete Ally became a nonprofit. But we were still really far away from being an organization with a theory of change and a strategy. There was still a lot that needed to come together in order to make meaning of the work, right? I think anybody who I talked to then and talk to now about the work of Athlete Ally agrees that there's a problem, right? The fact that there aren't more out athletes, the fact that participation rates and dropout rates are what they are for the LGBTQ community in sport means that there's work to do. But it's one thing to identify that. It's another thing to say, well, okay, how do we change it? What are the baby steps that get us to ending homophobia and transphobia in sport?
Well, also considering that, when you were doing this at that time, you had, after Fred helped you incorporate, you had the organization, you had the website, you had the pledge, and you had you and your girlfriend, right?
Yeah.
And you were, if I'm not mistaken, essentially, you got a lot of visibility. It's not often you see a handsome, white, all-American athlete out doing this kind of work. So you were on network TV, you were in magazines, you got your picture shown, and you were having quite an impact, but there's still not a lot of programming underneath that.
Right.
But you were being paid to go to schools, athletic departments, corporate affinity groups, LGBT groups, et cetera, to kind of deliver the message that allyship is important. Is that fair?
Yeah, I would say the first sort of philosophy of Athlete Ally was that there's never been a successful social justice movement for a minority group without the support of the majority. That if we're going to end homophobia and transphobia in sport, we need more allies to roll up their sleeves and commit to changing things. And so the first 3-4 years of Athlete Ally, I was a road warrior. I was going to about 50 colleges a year, working with athletes and coaches and administrators on how can we be better allies, and I wasn't ever and still don't presume to have all the answers, but I know my own I was really just telling my own journey, my own story, saying, look, we can do better. Sport should be a place where everyone belongs, where everybody can maximize their potential. And the fact that that's not true for the LGBTQ community is a choice. And we can change that. And so I really was just pushing hard to hammer that message home anywhere and everywhere I could.
You were having amazing impact, but you were kind of up against the wall of how you could scale that.
Yeah, because, you go to, I mean,
how many schools can you visit?
How many schools can you visit? How do you actually measure the efficacy of those visits? A couple things started to happen for us at Athlete Ally. First, there was a handful of professional athletes who agreed to lend their name, right? So Athlete Ally started before marriage equality was law. So straight athletes supporting marriage was still not the norm. You could count on two hands the number of allies in sport speaking out for marriage equality. And so the first couple of years was, how does Athlete Ally get to know those athletes, work with them, help them? And so Brendan Ibedejo, Chris Cluey, Scott Fujita, Sean Avery were kind of this.
And so Brendan was an all-star linebacker for the Baltimore Ravens Super Bowl winning team. Sean Avery was a starting forward or defenseman, I can't remember, for the New York Rangers hockey team. And those two actually ended up serving on our board with us.
Yeah. And it was like, here I was as a wrestler. I have some platform, but I don't have a fraction of the platform that a professional athlete has. What we found is that if we got really strategic about what Brendan was saying or what Sean was saying, or if Sean and Brendan were to ask 5 of their friends to get involved, we could very quickly start to amass a community of athletes who would listen to what those athletes had to say. And so very early on, Athlete Ally started to kind of, quote unquote, like punch above our weight because of our affiliation and the trust we were building with professional athletes. Sort of the secret sauce of Athlete Ally has always been our relationship with educating and activating professional athletes.
Well, if I'm not mistaken, it's been 6 or 7 years that you've been training every incoming NBA rookie on LGBT issues.
Yeah, so for 7 years in a row, myself and Jason Collins, we would work with all the rookies in the NBA. And so, look, progress moves at the speed of trust, and you can only build that trust through continued education, conversation, working together. But I think, as more and more athletes started to work with us, the trust grew, right? And so it became easier to get more ambassadors. And so now we have over 400 Olympic, Paralympic professional athletes who are ambassadors. We work with those athletes to write amicus briefs to the Supreme Court, to march on Washington, to write op-eds, to do public speaking.
To urge the NCAA to stand up for trans athletes' rights, et cetera.
I mean, you name it. Our athletes are on the front lines of trying to fight to make sport everything we know it can, it should be. But the beginnings all started in those early days where we realized that if athletes speak in one voice, there is nothing they can't accomplish. And so how we can better create that unity of athlete voice, the more impactful we'll be.
Is it fair to say that the next step up was when we started preparing for the Sochi Winter Olympics? Do you want to talk about that?
Absolutely. So, okay, here's a little athlete ally chugging along. We're really educating, having LGBTQ inclusion conversations all over the country. We're growing our ambassadors, but we then are met with this moment where you have the Sochi Winter Olympics happening in Russia, and in the lead up to those games, Russia passed an anti-gay propaganda law, which made it punishable by fines or arrests if you supported, quote, non-traditional sexual relations, basically in front of minors. So it was written in a way that really made any same-sex physical intimacy potential violation of this propaganda
or
law.
Discussion or support of it.
Yeah. Flying a rainbow flag, for instance, right? Anything that could be construed as propaganda, right? So that we have that over here, and then on the other hand, we have IOC's Rule 50. Rule 50 prevented athletes from making any political statements, gestures, or demonstrations in any Olympic venues. So the stage was set whereby if a gay athlete won an Olympic medal and they kissed their partner in celebration, they could be both in violation of Rule 50, because that could now be construed as a political demonstration, and they could be subject to fines or arrest.
In Russia,
right? So what was at stake was actually really major. And I think it just was a perfect moment where we could ask the question in really concrete terms, the relationship between the principles of a sport and its practice. How do we help make sure those two things align? And in looking over the Olympic Charter and the principles of Olympism, going through line by line by line, all of a sudden I literally was trying to think about how do we overcome Rule 50? How do we overcome this anti-gay propaganda law? Because we want to do a campaign, we want to make visibility and push, but I don't want athletes to get stripped of their medals. I don't want athletes to get fined or arrested. So what do? So going through the principles of Olympism, there I read the Principle 6 of the Olympic Charter. Discrimination of any kind is incompatible with belonging to the Olympic movement. Wow, that feels like everything that I would ever want an athlete to say about this anti-gay propaganda law.
Except it did not explicitly protect on LGBTQ expression, right?
So step one, athlete ally, let's write a letter to the IOC, International Olympic Committee, getting them to clarify that sexual orientation is protected under Principle 6 of the Olympic Charter. We get our ambassadors to co-sign that letter. 3 days later, we get a response. Yes, sexual orientation is included in Principle 6 of the Charter. Or at least it's implied that it's...
And later they would end up encoding it specifically.
Right. They would rewrite to actually explicitly have it mentioned. So, okay, we got that acknowledgement. That meant that we now had the foundation for a really strategic conversation, because we could have athletes competing at the Winter Games say, I support Principle 6 of the Charter, and doing so would not be in violation of Rule 50, because the IOC can't say that it's political for an athlete to support their own charter, and they can't say it's in violation of the propaganda law, right? Because they, in theory, should be abiding by Principle 6 of the Charter as hosts. And that campaign snowballed into, we had over 200 Olympic and Paralympic athletes vocally, visibly a part of the Principle 6 campaign.
We had Rihanna tweeting to 40 million followers. We had Alexander Wang designing beanies, cashmere beanies that were being sold with the proceeds going, as well as American Apparel designing clothing for Principle 6. So it was a big deal.
Yeah. The Australian bobsled team put Principle 6 on the front of their bobsled. I went to Sochi with Rob Smith, one of our other board members, to continue to beat that drum. All Out was also a really important partner. I should mention that. They mobilized millions of people to sign petitions in support of Principle 6 of the Charter, which I think our athletes speaking out plus All Out's strength in numbers really put pressure on the IOC.
All Out is kind of a change.org for LGBTQ rights. Petitioners sending in, urging people to act certain ways with millions of people on the ground in various countries around the world, right?
Yep, exactly. As you mentioned, they changed the language of Principle 6 to explicitly include sexual orientation. They built it into the bidding process for all future games. So now any country wishing to host the Winter or Summer Olympics must abide by Principle 6. Part of the UN Olympic truce, the resolution that they do leading up to the Olympics every year, they baked in Principle 6 into the Olympic truce. In fact, Kazakhstan was one of two countries bidding for the 2022 Winter Games. And at the time, they had an anti-gay propaganda law working its way through their legislature. And we again, organized the athletes, wrote to the IOC saying, hey, just to be clear, if they want to host the Winter Games, they must abide by Principle 6. Is that correct? 3 days later, we get a response. Yes, all countries must abide by Principle 6 of the Charter.
Publicly, publicized. I mean, it was in the news. And the result was the Constitutional Court of Kazakhstan overturned the anti-gay propaganda law.
They didn't pass it. It never became law. They dropped the bill from consideration. So that for us was this aha moment of, wow, here we are. We don't have an office. We don't really have the staff was the board, and this really kind of scrappy upstart of an organization affecting the policies of the International Olympic Committee, changing the practices of the ways in who hosts the Olympics forevermore. And that was a moment. It was like, wow, we can have big wins if we are able to get the athletes to use their power, use their platform to speak out. And so since then, we've tried to replicate that same model again and again and again. Sometimes, and so we've had some other major wins because of that. We helped overturn the hijab ban in international basketball, thanks to athletes signing on and speaking out. We helped increase the number of women in FIFA governance.
Again, this is us being allies, because that's not really part of our core work. But we believe really strongly in helping all discriminated against, populations be given the right to participate in athletics equally.
I think it's both in. I think it's both understanding that no one community can achieve full liberation if everyone doesn't, right? That all of these struggles are interconnected and cannot be separated from one another. And then two, if we're going to be successful in ending homophobia and transphobia in sport, we need to build a bigger tent. And so by showing up in solidarity with these other athletes and these other fights, we build that bigger tent, because the next campaign, those athletes are now signing on to support trans athletes or to support the moving of championships events out of North Carolina over anti-LGBTQ laws.
Well, with regard to that, just so our listeners know, there was an anti-trans bathroom bill in the state of North Carolina around 2015 or so, if I recall. And we worked really hard, and ultimately, and it wasn't easy. It was the first time, I believe, major sports leagues and or regulators ever acted in this way. We got both the NBA and the NCAA, the collegiate administrators and the basketball or regulators of the pro basketball leagues, to pull their championship events out of North Carolina until that bill was modified. It was it was kind of crazy how it happened, but that was a pretty big win.
It was huge. It was the first time in history that a sporting event has actually been moved over anti-LGBTQ laws. It wasn't perfect. There were still some really big problems with it, but it was, at a minimum, it's proof of concept that these things that we think are insurmountable are actually very malleable, very changeable if athletes join together and fight for it.
You might want to just describe briefly the kind of three silos we operate in.
Sure. So there's now four pillars to our work. The first being LGBTQ education. So as an organization, we are trying to make, or here's the problem statement: the people with the most power and influence are the least educated. So long path for us, we want to live in a world in which every single coach in the country is educated on LGBTQ respect and inclusion. Coaches are like mentors. They're really important in a young person's life, but they're oftentimes not equipped to make sport a welcoming space for our most marginalized youth. So we need a better baseline for coach education. So we are really working hard to do that. The second pillar of our work is about sports policy reform. So the problem statement is that the policies of sport don't reflect or protect the people who are trying to access sport. And we see this from non-discrimination policies, fan codes of conduct, trans inclusion guidelines, sexual assault and harassment policies. We talked about bidding. We're still seeing mega sporting events going to countries that are violating human rights across the board. So the relationship between the business of sport and the protecting and respecting and upholding the human rights of its constituents is an area where we are really trying to lead, and we're trying to fight for change there. So whenever we see a sport policy that we feel is falling short of those ideals, we're going to try to organize athletes to do something about it. I would say the more evergreen effort for us is something called the Athletic Equality Index, where we rank and report on the LGBTQ policies and practices of every NCAA Division I college in the country. So that's 353 schools, your most decorated, competitive NCAA institutions. We now rank on these criteria, which
using best practices of the actual NCAA regulators themselves. So we're not making that up ourselves, right?
A big first step before we even launched the AEI was working with the NCAA to define best practice. What is the gold standard? Knowing that we then wanted to use that NCAA resource as a way to rank and report where people stood. But that's been massively successful. I mean, we've seen the number of trans inclusion policies go up by 300%. So pillar one on the education front, if coaches are better educated, right, we're going to have higher participation rates for LGBTQ youth and better retention rates. So kids aren't going to be dropping out of sports. From there, we have that bridge between high school and college. Only 8% of high school athletes go on to play sports collegiately. For those listening, LGBTQ athletes drop out of sport at twice the rate of their heterosexual cis counterparts. So we need to basically bridge that gap so that kids aren't dropping out of sports. We think coach education is going to get us a good way there. But, I've talked to so many athletes who they come out freshman year of college and then they quit. And they transfer schools
because they don't feel comfortable.
It's not worth it. I'm not going to show up every day to a place that doesn't support and affirm me. I forget it. So the AEI is a great tool for that, because now we're able to show a young high school athlete, hey, here are the institutions that are really showing up and are putting their actions where their values are, right? In ways that you can rely upon. So I hope that in the future, LGBTQ athletes at the high school level will look to the AEI as evidence for where they should and shouldn't go athletically.
And more than that, millennial and Gen Z youth, even those that are not LGBTQ, are allies and have LGBTQ friends. And if they find that there's a school that's got a 0 score that's recruiting them, and there's another school with a 100 score that's recruiting, they may be more inclined to go to the one with a higher score because they treat their friends better.
Absolutely. And I'll put an asterisk on this that I think long-term for us, the AEI both need to expand to D1, D2, and D3 schools.
Division 2 and Division 3.
Right? So those are the maybe less, quote-unquote, competitive layers of the NCAA structure. But I think we also need to figure out how do we incorporate other metrics. If a school is showing up for their LGBTQ athletes but is really falling short in Title IX compliance, or supporting their female athletes or their athletes of color, then that measurement is going to be flawed, right? So we have to figure out, how does the AEI speak to other indicators of climate and inclusion and commitment? But I think we have a really powerful start.
We should also give a shout out to Adidas.
Yeah, Adidas has been an incredible partner for us and has really made it possible for us to scale our work and specifically scale the AEI. As you can imagine, ranking all of these schools and then following up and being in touch with each school, working with them to change policy, change practice, takes a lot of time and investment. And Adidas has helped fund our AEI fellows. So we're able to hire 25 PhD researchers from across the country to help us define the score and do the follow-up necessary to make the AEI work.
Did you finish the 4?
I did not. Number 3 is athlete activism. So basically the problem statement is that athletes are silenced. They are discouraged from using their platform. And, I believe that Colin Kaepernick not being on a team because he took a knee is the same thinking that...
Took a knee when the national anthem is being sung.
Yeah, thank you. That culture that punishes an athlete for speaking out also punishes or creates the perception of risk for an athlete coming out, right? And so unless and until there's a culture where athletes can be their authentic selves, where they're encouraged to stand up and speak out for what they believe in, there's still going to be barriers for LGBTQ athletes at the highest level of our sport. So we really try to change that through our ambassador program, which I mentioned, over 400 Olympic, Paralympic professional athletes, and through our athlete ally chapters. So we have now 45 chapters on college campuses. Those are groups run by current college athletes who are fighting to change policy and drive education and really, again, leading the way in making their campus a welcoming space. And then the 4th pillar is research. So I can tell you why I think this work is so important until I'm blue in the face, but there are some folks who really want to see the data to care, unfortunately. I would think that people would just want to be good people and hate is bad.
Make positive change.
Yeah. But look, the research that's done on the experiences of LGBTQ athlete is really lacking. We do not have accurate data to talk about, what are the LGBTQ demographics within sport at the collegiate level, at the high school level. There have been some studies done, but it's few and far between. So we're really doubling down, investing in research so that we can make it clear, A, here's your population that you are failing to serve, and B, if you invest in inclusive policies and practices, here's how your climate and culture is going to change. And we want to be able to...
It illuminates the need. Without that data, you can't prove that, in fact, the need is real. Right?
Absolutely.
Increasingly, the right wing is embracing opposition to transgender rights, and especially to the rights of trans athletes to be able to participate equally in competitive sports. Yeah. It's a complicated topic, but can you explain as well as you can in this short space why Athlete Ally embraces trans athlete access to sports and what we're doing to help bring it about?
Absolutely. So I'm going to begin with a couple basic premises, right? So basic premise 1 is that I think participation in sport is a good thing, right? It gives its participants unparalleled physical, social, and emotional growth. It teaches people how to overcome adversity and how to work as a team, and gives you self-confidence, and I think helps establish healthy habits that hopefully go with a person through the rest of their life. If we can agree to that, then premise 2 is that culture and environment should be accessible for our most marginalized young people, right? The people who are the most at risk to experience harm should be able to find a home in sport. And our trans youth is that community. They could benefit the most from sport, and yet they're given the least access. Our LGBTQ youth, and our trans youth in particular, they experience much higher rates of obesity, drug and alcohol use, suicide ideation, experiences of bullying and harassment. And the right has chosen to erase and eliminate the ability of trans youth to be their authentic self in a space that could save their life. And that is heartbreaking, because I believe that participation in sport is a right. I think that it's important that we fight for that right for our most marginalized young people.
Do we have, I know we have a lot of resources on the website, but do we have something that someone who's uninformed about this issue can turn to and educate themselves? Do you want to kind of help them understand how
we have lots of those resources at athleteally.org. Please dig in. I think when it comes to the policy of trans athlete participation, there's a couple different layers to this conversation. So first, what the right is doing is they're trying to shift the spectrum of what constitutes elite sports. So going back to 2011, there have been pathways for trans athletes to participate consistent with their gender identity, both within the NCAA and within the Olympic movement. Okay. Those policies require a medical intervention in order for an athlete to compete according to the gender with which they identify. There have been no issues with those policies. Asterisk, there are issues because the basis for which those policies are based is actually really problematic. But the fear that trans athletes are going to hurt the integrity of sport is completely unfounded, right? At really every level of sport. What's happening now is a shifting of what constitutes elite sport. There are people who say a kid as young as 12 years old should be required to undergo medical intervention if they want to compete consistent with their gender identity. Now, this is really harmful and problematic for a number of reasons. First, you're taking away the bodily autonomy of the individual. It creates gender policing. So if you suspect somebody is trans, you're now putting coaches and officials into a place where they have to police the gender of athletes in a way that's really problematic. We're also placing financial constraints on trans youth because a lot of transition-related care isn't covered by health insurance. So if you don't come from a place of family who can afford it, you're now putting a financial burden on participation. So we're just kind of compounding all the ways in which we're isolating and excluding and endangering our most marginalized young people. When it comes to the conversation of what about sort of testosterone and its impact on competitive excellence and performance? The truth is that there has not been enough data to prove the correlation between testosterone and competitiveness, okay? Every human body makes testosterone, right? We all make T at different levels, but we also have androgen sensitivity that differs. So that's why we have some people who are really muscular but have no body hair, who have lots of body hair but no muscles, right? Just because my body makes a lot of T doesn't necessarily mean that my body is going to quote unquote benefit because of that T production.
In terms of athletic performance.
Exactly, right? So it's not a one-to-one. So the policies that exist today, they are two-dimensional, right? They don't actually reflect the diversity of the human body. They are saying, okay, we're putting a number on the dartboard of you must have your testosterone level at or below this amount, right? Without ever taking into consideration whether or not there's androgen sensitivity, forget the uniqueness of a sport, right? What makes a ultra marathoner great at their sport is different than what makes a Olympic powerlifter great at their sport, right? It's different muscles, it's different types of strength that make an athlete exceptional. So basically,
well, the problem is that this becomes rife for people who want to demonize other to attack it. It's really not about fairness, equity, inclusion, relative performance. I mean, the fact of the matter is very rare that you have trans athletes winning championships, which is the threat that is held out by the right wing for why we shouldn't allow them to participate. So, in any event, go ahead.
But I would also say, we need to also get to a place where trans athletes can win championships, where they can be exceptional at their sport, and that we're not going to say that that's unfair and that's cheating, right? The only way in which that happens, if more research is actually done on the relationship between testosterone production, androgen sensitivity, and competitive excellence in a whole host of different sports at different levels. So that's why when you look at the new IOC framework on trans inclusion, it really puts a flag in the ground that says inclusion is our North Star. Evidence-based policy is our North Star. It has to be peer-reviewed research. We can't just be plucking arbitrary data out of the sky to decide who does and doesn't get to access sport. It has to be done in a really thoughtful way because people's lives depend on it. Their livelihoods depend on it. Their human rights depend on it.
I knew I opened up a ball of a can of worms, as they say, but I wanted to at least let people know we are dealing with this. And if anybody wants more information, we have it. You're a straight man who's dedicated his life, at least a decade and a half so far, to LGBT rights. And your wife, Leah, is a senior leader at ARCUS, the largest LGBTQ foundation, who's dedicated her life to LGBTQ. For people who are skeptical or questioning, what is it about this area that has inspired you with passion?
I mean, for me, I feel passionately that I am impacted by homophobia and transphobia. We all are. Homophobia is a weapon of sexism, right? Like what LGBTQ people are dealing with impacts everybody because it's policing masculinity. It's what I mean, the expectations that are placed on men are connected to homophobia, right? Like men dying younger because of the ways in which we live our lives, not being able to ask for help, our mental health,
to express feelings,
to
show weakness.
Yeah. All of the orthodox masculinity hurts men, hurts all men. Right. And I believe that if we achieve full and complete liberation for the LGBTQ community, everyone will benefit, right? I will be able to be my whole self, right? As progressive and inclusive as I feel I am, I still have shackles on how I live my life, right? I still feel as though I have to express my gender in a particular way. I have to hold myself in a particular way in order to be seen as legitimate in the eyes of a sports person, right? So there are these ways in which we are all put into these narrow boxes of expression, of identity that cause real harm. And so I don't know. For me, I also think that if I was alive during the civil rights movement, I would have liked to think that I would have fought and marched and done my part. And I really, truly feel that when we look back at this moment today, 50 years from now, we're going to be asking ourselves that question about what did you fight? Did you stand? Did you do your part?
For something beyond just your own immediate benefit.
Yeah.
So switching gears quickly, in addition to Athlete Ally, you're constantly expanding your passions and how you use your limited free time. So, for example, since you can no longer wrestle, you've become a jiu-jitsu specialist, right? But in fitting with your performing arts interests, and I don't know, maybe you can briefly discuss this, going back a long time, you've kind of become a top-notch magician. What is it about magic that has motivated and inspired you, and when did it start, and where are you with that now?
So I was very good at wrestling, not because I was the most athletic or the strongest, but because I'm a student of the sport. And I love studying film and technique. I still do. I still watch endless hours of footage whenever I can, because I believe that with persistence and practice, and if you do it really strategically, you can become great at anything. If you just have there's maybe a ceiling for all of us based off of what we're naturally born with, but I feel like we can all achieve pretty incredible heights of anything we pursue if we have the discipline to pursue it. And so for me, in my own kind of creative and aesthetic expression, there are definitely these areas where I've gravitated towards. Certainly jujitsu is sort of a replacement for wrestling. It's such a close cousin, but it's different. I am a student. I am learning. I just got my brown belt, but I still have so much to learn and become familiar with in that sport. And that not to go on a rant here, but we live in a society that teaches people to protect their egos. You learn to specialize in a field. And then once you specialize in that field, you are encouraged not to take risks outside of it. Don't look stupid. Don't don't do anything that might question your competency in a given field. And I am a big believer in leaning into those areas where I am a beginner. I love being a beginner at things because that's where I feel like my brain grows the most, where I can be the most expressive. And so I run towards these sort of creative outlets that I feel like are like technical, like I can actually track my progress towards a goal. So magic, yes, I love the creativeness of it because really magic is only limited by your imagination. You can create whatever effect you want, whatever you dream up. You then can work backwards to figure out how to make that effect possible. But the toolbox that you use is techniques. It's knowledge based. So that was always with me throughout my wrestling career. On all the bus rides and road trips, I would always have a deck of cards. It was also one of the ways in which I would sort of manage my stress of competition because I could just have a deck and I wouldn't be caught into the emotional current of competition. I could kind of remove myself and just almost like meditate with magic.
And there's also a lot of downtime in wrestling where you're able to do it.
A little bit.
And also, just from an athleteally standpoint, I know that when you've been training the NBA rookies, you can introduce them to magic, and that's a way of getting them to walk into your wheelhouse.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the magic community, I mean, there's a lot of introverts that use magic as a tool for social interaction. I mean, magic is so beautiful because you don't need to speak a common language in order to connect somebody through magic. So it's a beautiful gift to interact, to build rapport, to have fun. If somebody has defenses, it's definitely helps break those down. But I'm a serial hobbyist, so I do pumpkin carving, sandcastle building, egg painting, Paisanki egg dyeing. Like basically, if there's a tactical skill with my hands that's technique based that I can feel progress towards.
And as a side, you performed it. Is it the House of Magic in LA?
The Magic Castle.
The Magic Castle. And you have
sort of by accident, though.
But you've invented a couple of tricks of your own. You've got some CDs that we're selling with. I mean, so this is not just a little hobby.
It's definitely an obsession, and I'm always trying to create. I don't know. I don't know. I think that expression is a beautiful thing, and so I'm always trying to.
Well, if anyone ends up meeting Hudson out and about, ask him to show you a magic trick.
I will.
You'll be blown away.
I will have a deck of cards on me. I guarantee it.
You and Leah, and now your two daughters, recently moved away from the immediate New York area, kind of facilitated by the COVID, remote working phenomena.
Yeah.
And tell us where you ended up and how.
Yeah, we ended up moving to New Hope, Pennsylvania, which was an early settlement community. It was actually a part of the initial William Penn land grant. So King of England gave William Penn lots of land, and then he gave that land to early Quakers. So it was really a tool to incentivize Quakers, who at the time were religious radicals in England, to come to the New World, right? And so my mom's family actually were all early Quakers, and it turns out that New Hope is where a lot of them lived. And so when we were, COVID came, and it really was this opportunity to say, you know what? I think the world is going to be different when this pandemic is over. I think we'll be able to find a way to be more virtual, to have to commute less. I think technology allows it. At some point, the environment will require it. So I'm betting on a more virtual future. So we started to look, and New Hope was one of those places, 75 miles outside of New York City, 40 miles outside of Philly, and a lot of these beautiful old historic homes. And it was really serendipitous. A house came up on the market that was actually built by my ancestors. And so, we were able to write to the owners and show them old family photos and make the case that we really wanted to bring this back home. And we were so grateful that they accepted our offer. That we have no business. This market has been absolutely wild, but yeah, just so grateful and really happy to call New Hope home. Happy to call Bucks County home, which, if you're into politics, is also like, it's a swing. It's +1 Republican. Pennsylvania is a really important political state, so I'm also really excited to just be getting more connected in a community where my vote and my volunteerism hopefully will make a difference in other ways.
So finally, with such an eventful first decade as an activist in your rearview mirror, what goals do you have for the next 10 years?
Big questions. Athlete Ally is at the tip of this iceberg. I think there's so much potential, so much more that we can accomplish. Kevin Jennings always says this phrase, like, this is not the beginning of the end. This is the end of the beginning.
Kevin is the current CEO of Lambda Legal, by the way. Yeah.
Yeah. And that always has resonated with me. I feel like even though we're 10 years in, I still feel like there's the potential in front of us is limitless. So I think for Athlete Ally, I feel very confident in our theory of change, and like the pillars that we're investing in are right. There's probably ultimately going to be a fifth pillar, which nobody knows about, but among friends, I'm starting to believe increasingly that if we're completely successful in our work within sport, there's still going to be work to do kind of sport adjacent in the communication space. So right now we are in an asymmetrical communication landscape where the right is able to amplify anti-LGBTQ messages globally at the drop of a hat. And so I think we also need to think about what is the role of sports journalists in telling positive stories of LGBTQ athletes, of allies, making social justice in sport the norm.
So communication.
Yeah, on our existing work and those things, I think we're going to figure out how to go deep in some specific geographic regions. So when we think about education, sport policy change, and athlete activism, I want to sort of make a little ecosystem of work that we can apply to any geographic region. And with that will come, different communities will be at different places in their inclusion journey. So we're going to need to research and audit, like, well,
and metrics.
Right. What is the current climate? What are the needs that need changing? But then based on that, we should be able to say, okay, we know that through a series of trainings, we can change climate in the following ways. We know that if we change policy and practice, we can change climate in the following ways. If we organize athletes, we can get these things changed and to happen. That blueprint is then replicable globally. Step one is we need to have this sort of box of impact that we can apply in any geographic area. And then from there, we can start to look at so many other corners of this country where sport is everything, where it is the thing that a country loves and follows and listens to and strives for. And yet there's no LGBTQ conversation, right? Those 76 plus countries where you could be fined, arrested, or put to death for being LGBTQ, those countries love sport, right? Their athletes have a platform. So I think the future for Athlete Ally is just figuring out how we can authentically and thoughtfully show up in those spaces in ways that are scalable. And hopefully when we have this conversation 10 years from now, sport will look very different. I always think about, what does that athlete look like 10 years from now? What is their experience like in the locker room? What's their conversation look like with a coach or with their fan base or with their teammates?
And how open are they?
How out are they? Yeah. So I like to think that athlete 10 years from now can have that same conversation with a coach, with a player, with their family, regardless of where they live in the world, right? Regardless of what sport they play. And I think that we have a good blueprint. Obviously, we need a lot more investment, grow the team, grow the programming, but I really believe that if we change sport, we change the world. I think that it sport is one of the greatest socialization mechanisms in the world. I think sport, unlike any other institution, teaches boys how to become men, girls how to become women in ways that unfortunately are really toxic. But if we could get that right and get sport to be teaching a more compassionate form of masculinity, a more, in the future, if oh, you're a jock, you must be an activist, right? If that could be the assumption, then I think we could just accomplish some radical things. And I'm excited and honored to be able to be building it. Grateful for all of your support and service in making Athlete Ally what it is today. And yeah, excited for the next 10.
I didn't mention, because I wanted the folks to be on you. I got involved early and approached you and said, you have these great goals and you've done a lot, but I think there's so much more that can be done. That we were at a tipping point in society at the time. And I, along with Kevin, had joined his board at Glisten in the 90s and spent 9 years helping them build it. And I thought we could do the same thing with Athlete Ally. So I asked Hudson if he wanted some help. And he said, sure. I joined the board. And, our first few months were just figuring out what's a budget look like, and how do we set up programming and how are we going to afford staff? And then, well, wait a second, we need officers. And who wants to be chairman? And nobody raised their hand. So I said, okay. And I did it for 5 years. And tonight is a farewell. At the end of this month, I roll off. I have to tell you, I'll be choked up later, I'm sure. But it's been a wonderful experience, and I'll continue in my role as the chairman of a new emeritus board for the old farts. But I am so impressed. I want to thank you for sharing your story with our listeners. I want to thank you for being the incredible activist for the LGBT community that you've become. I want to thank you for providing me with purpose and meaning as I began to leave my business career 10 years ago. And I want to thank you for being my friend.
Thank you so much, Mike. Appreciate you.
Love you.